Thank you, Ainsley. Good morning, dear sisters and brothers. Now we are ready to begin our last day of this conference. And this session number 5 on our agenda carries the title, The Nicene Legacy. How does the Council of Nicaea shape our ecumenical and interreligious commitments 1700 years later? And the first speaker this morning, who will speak on the ecumenical part of this title, is the Reverend Dr. Susan Derber, who is an eminent theologian and an experienced ecumenist. She is a minister of the United Reformed Church in the UK and has served as the moderator of the Faith and Order Commission in the World Council of Churches, and she is currently the president from Europe in the WCC. And we were blessed at our opening Eucharist on Tuesday to sing her hymn for Nicaea, which was a world premiere. So please, Susan, thank you.
Thank you very much for your welcome. I'm sure, like me, you're still enjoying the afterglow of that wonderful evening we shared together last night. So thank you, Ainsley, for all you did to arrange that. It's wonderful. So first, let me bring you greetings. As a president of the WCC, I must bring you greetings from our General Secretary, the Reverend Professor Jerry Pillay, and from the 356 member churches, the millions of Christians represented through the World Council of Churches. And we work very closely with the Roman Catholic Church, who are full members of the Faith and Order Commission. So I bring you greetings. So, I found a wonderful book by Andrew Byrne, who was Dean of Salisbury in 1925, and he wrote, his book begins with this sentence: the celebration of the 16th centenary of the Council of Nicaea is the obvious duty of our church. And when I read that a little while ago, I thought, I'm not sure it would be quite so obvious today to all of us in the Fellowship of Churches. But I've been astounded, actually, and pleasantly surprised to discover that many people in many places you might not expect have been profoundly interested in this anniversary. So there are Christians who honour the Nicene Creed as a common statement of faith, but don't necessarily say it every Sunday, and those who use it regularly within worship and would say they pray it, but all of them have been celebrating this symbol of unity, as my Orthodox friends would describe it. And I know it's often said in ecumenical circles, doctrine divides, service unites. But here is doctrine that actually unites. And it's been wonderful to be able to celebrate that. There's been wide interest amongst all sorts of churches, including those we sometimes wrongly call new churches, Pentecostal, evangelical. All sorts of churches have been interested, and there have been many conferences and events around the world. I'm very busy at the moment with Nicaea. And of course we have called a world conference this year, in a couple of weeks' time, meeting in the land of Athanasius in Egypt. The 6th World Conference on Faith and Order, the 6th since 1927, so they're well spaced out. And it will focus on faith, unity and mission, inspired by this anniversary of Nicaea. Now, there are familiar ecumenical questions that Nicaea presents us with, some of which we've discussed at length here. So the filioque, for example, one of the most popular popular webinars the WCC has ever broadcast is the one recently about the Filioque. Who would have thought? But so it is. The date of Easter continues to be something that taxes ecumenical minds and hearts. And I think the issue now is really with the Orthodox, and they all agree about how to calculate the date of Easter, but they have different calendars. And for some, their calendar represents their identity, their nationhood, their cultural distinctiveness in the location. So we're pretty stuck there. And also an issue that for me remains about the Nicene Creed, but I have not heard much discussed, though I think it's there, is the gender language about God, the use of the word Father so often in the Creed. And I think it's true to say that gender has now become a much more difficult ecumenical question than it was, say, 40 years ago, or at the last World Conference 32 years ago. There are other issues that I think still haunt us from Nicaea, challenge us. Is the church only for the pure, for those who kept faith during the persecution or in difficult times of other kinds? And what are the markers of purity? That question, I think, continues to rise again and again throughout Christian history. Our relationship with Jewish tradition and communities is raised particularly painfully by Nicaea, and Jacob, I think, will talk more about that. Orders in the church and the relationship between them, church and state, and the church and economics. I remember that canon about the church, the clergy not lending money at interest. I'm fascinated by the canons, and on Saturday I will be speaking at a United Reformed Church Synod, and I'll be delighted to tell them that they meet twice a year, once in Lent and once in the autumn, just as one of the canons of Nicaea asked. There are issues I often hear raised today. Was Nicaea the time when Christianity invented heresy and condemned some as heretics? Was Nicaea exclusive, putting up barriers to minority voices? And in times in the ecumenical movement when we want to give particular attention to minority voices, how do we deal with the issue of barriers? What are the limits? How do we honour diversity in ecumenism today? So last year I went to, or was it earlier this year, I went to a meeting of the Churches Together in England forum, and the title of it was One But Not the Same, and then a sub-clause, celebrating difference and diversity. It's as though diversity and difference are now more important than unity in some places. And then people ask, how do we preserve the good traditions about freedom of conscience and belief that many Christians have wanted to celebrate, and the value of I believe, personal faith, alongside we believe, the faith of the church? And I was intrigued that the Roman Catholic wonderful response to the faith and order text, the church towards common vision, included a phrase about we need more attention to personal salvation. I thought that was an interesting example of receptive ecumenism. And then this is an issue I hear often raised. Why does the Nicene Creed not mention Jesus' life and his teaching? Just moves straight from his birth to his death, suffering and death. Why does it have nothing in it about ethics or justice? And this phrase seems to pop up constantly on my Facebook feed. Consider this, there is not a single word in the Sermon on the Mount about what to believe, only words about what to do. It is a behavioural manifesto, not a propositional one. Yet 3 centuries later, when the Nicene Creed became the official oath of Christendom, there was not a single word in it about what to do, only words about what to believe. And I would love to have brought Robin Myers to Rowan's lecture yesterday, which I think demonstrated so evidently the implications of the creed for ethics and justice. So I'm not for a moment saying I agree with Robin Myers, but I recognise that there are many who say such things about Nicaea. And then there are those who say, well, the Nicene Creed was written in Greek, it relates to a particular context. How can it have any impact in very different contexts today? Does God only speak Greek? There are those who think because it's Greek, it's therefore abstract, whereas of course at the time, Greek was the language of the streets. And I heard a fascinating lecture recently about early Syriac translations of the Nicene Creed and the problems they wrestled with in how to put the ideas of Nicaea into a very different universe. But the one most divisive issue today, I think, in ecumenism is the question of empire in relation to Nicaea. And the first time we began to have a serious conversation about marking the Nicene anniversary in Faith and Order at the WCC, quickly, very quickly, there was a division between those in the room who wanted to say the bishops who went to Nicaea are all saints, there they are with their halos, and Constantine is the 13th apostle. It's one side of the room. Then on the other side, we had those who were saying Nicaea was the moment that the church sold out to empire. And I could see immediately that this was going to take some handling. And this divide opens up when perhaps you have radical Reformation Christians in the room, Mennonites and Orthodox, or it opens up when you have Christians from the global north, as we are, and Christians from the global south. And this is not only a question about the historicity of Nicaea, how much influence did Constantine have over the discussions and so on. It's also a question of how the Nicene Creed has played a part in later history. And of course there are some who still live with the parody of Nicaea that's there in the Da Vinci Code. You know, that Nicaea was the time when they turned the radical prophet of Nazareth into a divinity when they chose the books of the canon and so on. I once sat next to a Coptic bishop in a Faith and Order meeting for several days, and he was constantly writing emails throughout trying to get the film The Da Vinci Code banned in Egypt. And I think he succeeded. So here's a picture that many will cite as an example of the way that Christianity has a colonial heritage, not related directly to Nicaea, but we have a white Jesus surrounded by children from all over the world. And I know people, I've met them recently, who will say that they experience the Nicene Creed, first of all, as a tool of the British Empire. So that's part of the story of colonialism. And it's also a story about who we think God is. So it's not just a historical question or a question of recent history, it's also about who is the God that Nicaea reveals. Is it a God like an empire, like an emperor, or is it a God whose being we see in the crucified one? So decolonisation is a key theme at the World Council of Churches and in many churches and ecumenical organisations today. It represents a call to the church and to the world to address the legacies of colonialism, racism and slavery. And it's not only about changing political relationships, but addressing the long-term impacts of past and present colonialism in terms of perceptions of the other and of economic and climate injustice too. colonialism takes new forms today. And it includes a recognition that the international ecumenical movement, at least partially, had its beginnings in the colonial enterprise. Think of the Edinburgh Conference. And Faith and Order has worked hard, but not entirely successfully yet, to be broader than European and North American styles of doing theology. So I want to tell you about one of the many ecumenical meetings I've been to about Nicaea. And this was a truly remarkable one. It was organised by the United Society of Partners in the Gospel, an Anglican mission society. And there were 13 of us, theologians from all over the world. There's a woman there from the Pacific, there's India, South Africa, New Zealand, New Zealand, India, Greece, Serbia, Britain, Brazil, Orthodox and different shades of Protestant and indigenous Christian. And you'll see we included in our meeting a visit to the shore of the lake at Nicaea. And this is the moment where we said the Nicene Creed together. And you might be able to see that I've taken my shoes off to stand, as it were, on holy ground. So the meeting was called with this question: how do we revisit the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea in a spirit of honesty, humility, and hope? And how do we reaffirm our common faith in times which can be described as uncommon amidst all the things that we're experiencing now? So we took a pilgrimage to the ancient city of Nicaea. We embraced playfulness as a method for our theological imagination, and we sought to hold together orthodoxy and orthopraxis as integrally connected. There was a broad diversity of perspectives, as you can imagine, but also deep and growing friendship and a shared longing for a just world. So we recognise the unity in Christ that the Nicene faith brings, the confession of Christ's divinity within the life of the Trinity. But we looked at the question of Nicaea through the lens of empire. And we thought this was important because of the entanglements between Nicaea and the imperial interests of Constantine, but also because of the continuing entanglements of church and empire born out of later European enslavement and colonisation, and ways in which even today church and theology become tools of imperial ambition and control. Think of Trump, think of Putin, think of Tommy Robinson in this country, even Nigel Farage. You will have your own examples. And we asked, were there ways in which those who gathered in Nicaea managed to transcend imperial interests? And how do we do that today? So we recognise the temptations of collusion, and we recognise that the Nicene Creed might be seen not as an innocent text because of the ways that it has been used. Here, even in Wales, children who grew up with Welsh as their mother tongue were compelled in some places to recite the Nicene Creed in English. We came to the conclusion together in this remarkably mixed gathering that Nicaea was in the empire, but not of the empire. And our conversation led us to see that Nicene faith may be lived in a way that is profoundly subversive of empire. And we open the possibility of choosing to reread or read the Creed through this lens. So this is just some examples of the way we did this. So we saw that the powerful phrase, one Lord, transfers allegiance from Caesar to the crucified and risen Kurios. We saw that homoousios, of the same being, abolishes any ladder of lesser divinities modelled on imperial hierarchy. We recognise too that if you say Jesus of Nazareth, the one who had compassion on the poor, washed the disciples' feet, and was a victim of empire, was of the same being as God, then you're saying something very radical about God. If you read the first person of the Trinity through the lens of the second, you have a deeply anti-imperial God. The endless kingdom that Jesus inaugurated relativizes every other regime, and the Spirit who spoke through the prophets installs within the creed this perpetual criterion for critiquing idolatrous power, including ecclesial forms of it. So that's where we got to. I have other things I could say, but I hope that gives you a flavour of some of the ecumenical discussion about Nicaea. So we await in a couple of weeks' time the 6th World Conference. Charlotte will be there, and it will bring together church leaders and theologians of different traditions: Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Lutheran, Anglican, churches of the Reformation, Pentecostals, and we come together at the time when the world faces all that it faces now, to call one another, as we always do, to visible unity, inspired by the Council of Nicaea. So there I must stop for now. Thank you.
Good morning. Are you keen on a paper on Nicaea? I'm glad to hear. I don't know whether it's appropriate here in Cardiff to tell a story about, well, it's an Irish joke actually, but I hope you forgive me. It's a rather well-known story about an Englishman who gets lost in a village in Ireland. And the Englishman asks for directions. And the reply he receives is, if you want to go there, you shouldn't start from here. I think that the joke carries a few hermeneutical insights about the rule and significance of starting points. My task here is to reflect on Nicaea in light of interreligious relations, or perhaps interreligious relations in the light of Nicaea. So if we want to go there to a meaningful, constructive reflection on interreligious relations, is Nicaea a good place to start? I think there is more than one answer to that question. On the one hand, Nicaea is by necessity a part of our journey as Christians. And I think that the days we have spent together here testify to this. Brilliant lectures, stimulating, interesting discussions at the heart of Christianity. Good food. Did I mention good food? On the other hand, that does not mean that the road that Nicaea is part of is a smooth and easy one. Nicaea is both a foundation and a barrier. Nicaea itself was, of course, as we heard, not an event, not a single event, it was a process. And part of that process involved shaping Christian unity and Christian authority. And one of the tools used to achieve this was to distance the Christian community from other groups, among them the Jews. As we know now, the parting of the ways between Christianity and Judaism was a much longer and more complex process than earlier generation of exegetes thought. By the time of Nicaea in 325, that process was not yet finished. Nicaea contributed to the formation of what we today might call a distinct Christian identity vis-à-vis Judaism. That process had, of course, begun much earlier, but the role of Nicaea in this regard is, in that sense, it's not surprising and it's not in itself deserving criticism. But I think we should reflect critically and self-critically on the way that parting took place and on the way it took place through Nicaea, because it includes some of the dark chapters of Christian-Jewish relations. And of course we can observe that on the one hand it's a necessary process to define orthodoxy, to create unity and thereby also setting limits. But the means to do that has sometimes included harsh and exclusionary measures against those who were deemed as outsiders. In a letter preserved by the historian Eusebius, Emperor Constantine, recently after the Council of Nicaea, writes about the council and what he sees as the significant decisions. And I quote a little bit from this. At this meeting, the Council of Nicaea, the question concerning the most holy day of the Paschal celebration was discussed. And first of all, it appeared an unworthy thing that in the celebration of this most holy feast we should follow the practice of the Jews, who have impiously defiled their hands with enormous sin, and are therefore deservedly afflicted with blindness of soul. For we have it in our power, if we abandon their custom, to prolong due observance of this ordinance to future ages, by a truer order, which we have preserved from the very day of the Passion until the present time. So let us then have nothing in common with the detestable Jewish crowd, for we have received from our Savior a different way. So we see that the negotiation of Christian unity at Nicaea was to some extent carried out at the expense of the Jews. Of course, there were other villains of Nicaea, perhaps most notably Arius. Again, we can observe mechanisms of othering that have implications also for interreligious relations. And if you follow me here, according to the Islamic tradition, there is a well-known story of a Christian monk, Bahira, a Syrian monk, a holy hermit from Bosra, who happened to meet Prophet Muhammad at a very young age, when Muhammad was at a very young age, a young boy. And the Christian monk was increasingly amazed and recognizes in Muhammad a true prophet, someone chosen by God. And we have similar stories also in other religious traditions where the legitimacy of someone's testimony is given from an outsider. So here Christianity legitimizes Islam from a Muslim perspective, of course. Okay. So this is a well-known story. Of course, there were Christian apologetics and also Christian anti-Muslim polemics who did not appreciate this Muslim story. And they used, of course now we are after Nicaea, used already established categories from the Nicene Council in order to discredit this story. So one took the monk Bahira and claimed that he was, for instance, according to John of Damascus, an Arian heretic who misled the Arab people. So the strategy was not to deny that the meeting or the story had taken place, but to question the status of the monk Bahira. John of Damascus describes his belief that Jews, Arian, and Nestorians were all in different ways behind Muhammad's religion. And in this way, in one way, this is a very common human strategy that we can see repeating itself throughout history, to use to use concepts that you already have to explain that which you don't really know. And in this case, the monk Bahira and the legitimacy he gives to Muhammad was reinterpreted by Christians through the framework of the well-known Arius, whom Christian history has charged and deemed as a heretic and a schismatic. So if Bahira was an Arian, that explains Muhammad's teaching, and it provides Christians with a vocabulary and a precedent on how to handle Muhammad and also Muslims. On this somewhat brutal image, we see how Christian artwork envisions the fate of Arius cruelly bleeding to death. And by turning Bahira into an Aryan and thereby implicating that Muhammad too was something of an Aryan, one could draw on these familiar and authoritative rejections that were already there in the Christian tradition. So we can see that Christianity in its relation to Nicaea have had its difficulties with living with differences, with living with otherness. And I think this is a stream that runs throughout the Christian tradition. We see it in relation to Judaism, we see it in relation to Islam, but also in relation to others of the Christian tradition. Of course, this is not unique to Christianity. We see this also in other religious traditions, the notion of otherness and the challenge of otherness. So what can we make of this? And this is perhaps not a very happy ending to a happy conference, but I think I will provide also some constructive tools to reflect on this. And I will end with three lessons that I think could be made of this in an interreligious perspective. First, Nicaea is a reason to take theological responsibility. So we have seen that the aspects of the Nicene Legacy involves enmity, exclusion, and contempt for the other. This is not unique for Christian tradition, but it's still important to raise the aspect of theological responsibility. We live in a time when anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, also Christophobia are on the rise. And there are several factors, of course, that is driving this development, including political events in the Middle East and so on. But that does not contradict the fact that also there are Christian theological roots to some of these different forms of racism. And as the church historian Jaroslav Pelikan reminds us, practically every major Christian writer during the first 5 centuries wrote against Judaism in a major work, or maybe the dominant theme in a work aimed for another subject. Almost every major Christian writer during the first 5 centuries. This is not by accident. This is according to a theological logic of superiority, to which also Nicaea belongs. So there are, and there have been, theological reasons for Christianity to discredit Islam and Prophet Muhammad in particular. For many, it was incomprehensible how someone could testify to the belief in the one God with such a tremendous success after Jesus of Christ. So, I mean, it's a theological anomaly from a Christian point of view. And I think here that the Scottish priest and Islamologist William Montgomery Watt is onto something when he observes that, and I quote, "None of the great figures of history is so poorly appreciated in the West as Muhammad. Western writers have mostly been prone to believe the worst of Muhammad, and wherever and whenever an objectionable interpretation of an act seemed plausible, it had been tended to accept it as a fact." So in other words, the Christian tradition contained a stream of theologically motivated hostility towards, among others, Judaism and Islam. Of course, this is not all there is in Christian Jewish and Christian-Muslim relations, but still it's a pattern that we need to see and understand and reflect on. And it is a pattern that is related to also current streams of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And I think also we should recognize that these two, sometimes, at least in the political discourse that we see today, they are treated as two separate streams. You don't have the energy or even the political analysis to counter both of these at the same time. You have to choose one of them. Either you're against anti-Semitism or you're against Islamophobia. But I think that the history of the three religions also testify to the fact that these kind of hatred belong to each other. And we see this actually early on in the Christian tradition, that the very term Judaism, for instance, did not refer to Jews or what Jews believed, but was more of a label of what Christianity was not. So it was more an identity marker from Christianity. And with that kind of logic, also Muslims, by Christian, were described as Jews. They had a Jewish behavior, they had Jewish beliefs, and they were Jewish in their way of living. So in that sense, we can see that the label of Jewish is also applied to Muslims historically. So how do we resist these theologies? It's not only a matter of being kind to one another on a personal level. It is also not a matter only of refraining from hateful speech. It is also a matter of theological responsibility. And I think that the Jewish theologian Jacob Neusner phrases this in a very good way. And he says that the challenge, also from a Jewish perspective, but in this case from a Christian, how can I form a theory of the other in such a way that within my own belief I can respect the other and accord to the other, to the outsider, legitimacy within the structures of my own faith? And here, fortunately, I think there are resources within the legacy of Nicaea. At its core, of course, Nicaea proclaims the belief in the one true God. This serves as a foundation for Jewish-Christian and Christian-Muslim relations and testifies to the similarities between the traditions. Of course, we know that similarities can be both a blessing and a burden, but still, it is a foundation for the three faiths. Moreover, while many issues remain ecumenically divisive between denominations, interreligious relations are rarely among them. Of course, interfaith dialogue can be debated and questioned, and we can have different opinions about theologies of religion, but that kind of diversity is rarely between denominations. It's within the different denominations. In that sense, I think there is an ecumenical basis also for the task of interreligious relations, of theology of religions. Sometimes people think that interreligious dialogue is about minimizing religious differences, finding the lowest common denominator, but experience differs from that view. Christians, Jews, Muslims motivate their collaboration, their involvement theologically based on their own religious traditions. So, in that sense, that one finds motivations, foundations for issues such as religious freedom, human dignity, and so on within the structures of one's own faith, not as a minimal common denominator. So making space for the other is not about leaving one's space, it is rather on the basis of one's own faith, provide space for the religious other. And this is also both in theology and also in society, without betraying one's own tradition. And for Christians, some of the roots of this work of shared openness comes from the Incarnation and from the theology of the Nicene Council. Through the Christology of Nicaea and the notion of covenant, there are resources to express, to articulate a theology of appreciation and a legitimacy that Jacob Neusner calls for. It's not possible to develop it more thoroughly here, but in the notion of covenant, we can see that universal promises, unique revelation, and profound rootedness are found together. Through the covenant, we can testify to God's love to all creation, and still, that covenant does not situate us in a God's eye or bird's eye perspective. There may be other covenants and callings, other stories, not visible from a Christian viewpoint. From a Christian perspective, we appreciate that every covenant in some way must be related to the covenant of Jesus Christ. But the fact that we do not know exactly how provides also the Christian theological tradition with resources of hermeneutical and doctrinal humility that can make space also for other traditions and the legitimacy also of other traditions. So the bold testimonies of Nicaea can make room both for the universality of Christ's love and also for the recognition of other faiths. And third and finally, Nicaea deserves our critical appreciation. As also Rowan William mentioned yesterday, a few decades after Nicaea, a new council was held. This council in Constantinople in 381 revisited the Nicene Creed and actually deemed it necessary to make certain revisions. In the third article, the Creed of 325 simply states, "We believe in the Holy Spirit," and then one proceeds to anathematize the Arians in a long way. The most notable revision between 325 and 381 were arguably the development of a more explicit doctrine of the Holy Spirit and the omission of the strongest and worst anathemata from Nicaea. And I think this revision also points us into a direction of fertile ground for future interreligious dialogue and mutual exploration. First, the Christian tradition's proclamation of belief in the Holy Spirit introduces, of course, the perhaps most elusive aspect of the Godhead, a person that cannot be captured, silenced, or restrained. I think this is a reminder also against more triumphalistic views of the Church or of Christianity. And it underscores the theology rooted in humility and also recognition of mystery. And second, although the Council in 381 did not mark the end of ecclesial condemnations or anathemata, its revision of the 325 Creed demonstrated a measure of restraint in this regard. And for Christian-Muslim and Christian-Jewish relations, I think it offers a hopeful path, a basis for dialogue that can transcend caricatures and mutual condemnation. So, getting back to the initial story, if we want to go there, we perhaps could start here. Thank you so much.